Well, welcome everyone to our latest edition of the Mediate.com Book Club. I am Colin Rule, CEO of Mediate.com, and I am delighted today to have two giants of dispute resolution practice here to join me to talk about their new book, International Conflict Resolution Processes. So we have the mother of ADR, Carrie Menkel-Meadow here, and my very, very good friend, Andrea Kupfer Schneider. So wonderful to have the two of you. Thank you for making the time, and I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. So thank you.
Thanks, Colin. We are happy to be here.
Great, great. So let's dive in. Wow, this book is amazing. I mean, this thing is such a rich volume. I mean, it's a tome. I have no idea how you got the permissions for all of these incredible articles. That must have been a huge, huge task. And it's absolutely a tour de force. I mean, the two of you, obviously, I don't need to do an introduction. If you need to know anything, I'm sure everybody watching this and on the call knows a lot about Andrea and Carrie already. But, this is based on, decades and decades of travel and teaching. So, tell me what motivated you to put this together?
Well, the origins of the book, I'll just say a little bit about the beginning and then how we came to do this together. A little over 15 years ago, I was the faculty director and professor of Georgetown's Center for Transnational Legal Studies in London, which was a program Georgetown established to teach international comparative law in a program, although based in London, that consisted of 20 different law faculties. So as you all know, anyone on this call would know, I was teaching all forms of ADR as a dispute resolution person and also teaching international law, not just in the United States, but in other countries. And in the CTLS program, the people that knew I was an ADR person were very anxious to learn about ADR. This is 2009, so it had already spread ADR to many other countries. I was just talking to Berlin about Canada, and I had by that time taught in about 20 countries. And so there was a strong student interest in learning about international dispute resolution processes. So I want to say that for me, and that's why Andrea was such a fabulous collaborator, as many of you know, Andrea and I had already written 4 different texts. A big book, Dispute Resolution Beyond the Adversarial Model, and then splits on negotiation, which we're both experts in, and mediation, which we're both experts in. And so the idea was to open out the domestic book into an international book. And the second goal, anyone who knows me knows that I've taught experientially all my life. I've been a law professor now for 50 years. Wow. And I have always taught experientially. And so it was a big deal at CTLS in London that I started to teach about processes with role plays and simulations, including one that I still use that actually began at Harvard, where Andrea went to school and where I've taught, doing international treaty negotiations. And then international arbitration and trade arbitration. And then what became my interest while I was there in London, and I've done a lot of work on that since then, all the hybrids, all the hybridization, mediation, arbitration.
I want to get back to that because that's a big chunk of the book is the hybrids.
Okay. So all I want to say is it was a great, I think both of us would say, a great work of love, because those were my goals at the beginning, to teach and open out dispute resolution internationally, but also to do it by teaching experientially. And aside from the ADR parts of it, it was a great contribution to international pedagogy, because after I started doing this at CTLS, I then started to get asked to teach these courses in Asia, Singapore and China, in Australia, Melbourne, all over Europe, Belgium, France, England, Italy, and Israel. These are all places that I've taught with these materials.
Sure.
And as you say, it was decades in the making. It took a very, very long time. And I didn't want to do it alone. And so I called my dear friend and colleague, Andrea, and I have to say, we put this in ultimately together a little faster than all of our textbooks. So I'll stop there with the intro, and then we'll follow up with whatever questions you have.
And I'll just say I came to this a little differently. As Carrie notes, at law school, I was a research assistant for Roger Fisher back in the day, and a lot of his work had been international, and had taught a class on coping with international conflict, co-authored with that. And then when I became a law professor, started teaching, I had also taught international law, taught dispute resolution, very, very clearly saw the overlaps. Started to teach a class in international conflict resolution, and there wasn't great stuff out there. I mean, part of it was just the, scrambling to put together your own material. Many of the books that sort of focused on dispute resolution were heavy on one of the processes, on arbitration, or they were very heavy on, read the prints and learn diplomacy. But there wasn't really a good survey that you could pick and choose among all of these things. And so Carrie and I had been, as we were wrestling with our other textbooks and having fun on our, one chapter we were allowed to write on international, continually talking about like, what would it look like to actually have, more than a few of our favorite articles, but all of our favorite stuff together to make it more possible, not only for us to teach exactly what we want, but for everyone, for other faculty coming into this to be able to say like, here's the material so that anybody could do this.
Well, and I definitely get that sense looking at the book, as you say. I mean, Carrie, I know you've been all over the world. I think you guys say this is teaching in over 25 different countries over 15 years, to be able to have a source book like this, I mean, and a teaching guide connected to it with all these case studies. I mean, this is just a wealth of resources. Who were you picturing in your mind when you were putting this together? Like what's the ideal professor or course type for using a book like this from your perspective?
Well, one thing I'd say is, I'm sure most people listening would know this. In most of the world, law is an undergraduate first degree. Only in the United States and Canada and Australia now too is law a second degree. So the challenge is to be rigorous and multi-layered and also sufficiently accessible, because when I've taught with this in Europe and Asia, for example, the students are studying law as their first degree. So as we say in the book, it is interdisciplinary. There's political science material in it. There's a little sociology, all the stuff we would teach interdisciplinary.
Well, you call it a socio-legal approach. Right. So you're willing to take both lenses.
Right, because other people here would know, I've been a socio-legal scholar as well as an ADR scholar since I began. In fact, I'm not at the Law and Society meetings this weekend, which are going on in Chicago, but ordinarily it would be. And so the idea was, the ideal student is someone who's interested in international conflict processes. And I will put in a big plug, especially peace, the peaceful resolution. And I guess the other thing I would say is, as Andrea mentioned, most conventional work in this area is either public international law, that is the law of nations, or private international law, that is international commercial arbitration. And then there's the hybrid, of course, of investment and trade disputes, the WTO, now more or less extinct, and all the international arbitral tribunals. So the idea is to paint a broad enough picture so that people would understand that international conflict processes span a variety of processes, and they're both public international law and private international law. And so it's intended, obviously, for people that would like to be international lawyers at the law school level, but it's also intended for intelligent people to learn about the world and to learn about all the different ways that processes might be used outside of the law, so beyond the law. And
sure.
So I would say that, the ideal student could be at almost any level. And that was the challenge for us to write what I'm proud of, I think a pretty rigorous book, but also one that's pretty accessible.
Well, and you've got Machiavelli, you've got Mary Parker Follett. I mean, you've got so many voices. I mean, one of the questions I had for you, you talk about process pluralism, and I want you to discuss that a little bit further by what you mean by that. But I was wondering, I love at the end of the introduction, you say, let us know what you think. I'm sort of wondering, do you feel like you're advancing? You have so many different voices here, and it's so many cross currents, so many ideas, so much rich grist for a great classroom discussion or someone trying to get their feet wet in the space. But do you feel like you're advancing a certain perspective with this book? I mean, do the two of you feel like, what's the takeaway, or is it to present all of this gorgeous, massive thought and then have different people resonate with different pieces of it? Like what was the objective in that sense?
I mean, I think you've nailed it, Colin. That second point of, one goal I think for both of us always teaching is we want to give you lots of lots of different approaches. And in any of the books that we've worked together, we're not saying this is the one way to do, anything, fill in the blank. We like the idea. If you think that readings are contradictory or raise questions between themselves, that's great. That means that you're actually being forced to think for yourself and wrestle with how reality operates. Because there's theory, there's reality, there's everything in between.
Sure.
And we think that that's great. And at the same time, I think we are pro peace. We tend to want conflicts to be resolved efficiently, effectively, fairly, all of those kinds of things, and to understand, and I'll turn this to Carrie to talk more about process pluralism, but to really understand that the designing and the thinking about how we bring people to the table, who we bring to the table, how we equip them to come to the table, all of these structural questions really matter. And we want to also give everyone the tools to really think about those things as well.
Let me just add, as someone who coined that phrase, process pluralism, that the idea is for anybody, law students and intelligent students, to say, what is the appropriate process for this kind of conflict? One size does not fit all. That's kind of my mantra. But it's also because I spent years of teaching international law. And the socio-legal part, Colin, is that law is not the answer to a lot of these problems.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
As we can see right now. When I taught with the materials before we published them 2 years ago, when the Ukraine war began, my friend Harold Coe is in the process of arguing in front of the International Court of Justice that the Russians were misguided in using genocide as their excuse for invading Ukraine. And so I opened the course by having my students able to watch Harold's argument at The Hague. And I use that to say, is this going to resolve this problem? Of course not. Of course not. So what is gained by having a formal argument in front of an adjudicatory body where a lot of international law is being discussed? And we'll talk about that and what's the forms of advocacy that might be appropriate in that tribunal. And then when we stop watching this argument, let's talk about what's really going to happen. So here we are, almost 3 years later. And so now when I teach stuff, we talk about the diplomatic efforts, what's happening with negotiation. That's a political science problem. And who do we think is going to resolve it? I was at a meeting yesterday and someone suggested the Pope was going to sit down, the new Pope, with all his goodwill, was going to sit down and try to mediate. So I don't love that we have conflicts and disputes in the world, but I love to take ones that are in the real world, Israel, Gaza, Russia, and Ukraine, and have the students try to figure out what do you think are some of the best processes and who? So since we're talking about a lot of mediation, who do you think could mediate? And that who question can be unpacked very interestingly too, because who is a body? It could be the church, it could be a country, muscle mediation like the United States tried in North Korea, or it could be an individual. And so it's wonderful to have these thought experiments and discussions in class. What are all the different ways? And the idea, again, my theme in my work is how can you encourage creativity? To what extent are we bound by, the International Court of Justice, which has been pretty ineffective in these kinds of things? And what new things might we come up with? That's the process pluralism part. And I guess I want to say one other thing that's a paper I'm working on now, and that is false analogies. In international relations, it's very easy to say either, let's not be Neville Chamberlain and give in too quickly, as he did in Munich. And so that caused people sometimes to be more aggressive than they ought to be. And the counterpoise to that was during Vietnam, which I was an active demonstrator against, the domino theory. We have to go in there and prevent the communists from taking over Southeast Asia. So you juxtapose those two, don't give in too much, negotiation, or go in and prevent bad things from happening, aggression or whatever. And what's in between, and what are the factors that we use to decide what an appropriate intervention is? And then, since I know many of whoever's listening to this are, very likely domestic mediators, what lessons, if any, do we have when we look at these very big conflicts, that are at this point quite unmanageable, a lot of them? What lessons are there for our more every day-to-day thing? And one of those is that process pluralism message. Just because the court tells you to mediate in a certain way, that
Absolutely.
may not be appropriate in this case.
Well, and I see Jim put a thing in the chat, and I think let's get to that. I have a couple more questions that I want to, but I want to make this a conversation between all of us. And I could easily talk to the two of you for 5 hours, and I'd still have lots of questions. I think the way you structure the book is very interesting, right? I mean, I do want to talk about, because you have written about domestic conflict resolution, and this is international conflict resolution. So I want to talk about some of the issues that surface there. In particular, I'm interested in the cultural component, which seems to be a thread that goes through all of the sections in the book. But I think a lot of us in the dispute resolution field would feel very comfortable looking at the first, couple chapters. We're talking about negotiation, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, multi-party, adjudication. And I think, but then we start to get into the stuff that makes it much more complicated, much more interesting. I agree with you. I think the cliche at the DoD is that the Army is always fighting the last war, right? So, the Neville Chamberlain example is constantly cited of saying, don't give in, fight, win to the death. And then Vietnam is the counterexample of, not being willing to engage in peacemaking and negotiation. It just continues this relentless meat grinder of the process, hoping that somebody's going to give in. But I love one of the things that you say, I think it was in the introduction, you said, yes, there are new forms of conflict emerging all the time, which challenge our old ways of thinking about this. But there's also new forms of cooperation. And I think that oftentimes we don't focus on that too. Like all of the changes that are coming in, and I personally thank you very much for including a chapter on online dispute resolution and artificial intelligence. We're going to have way new kinds of conflict, certainly, and everyone's focused on the conflict, but we're also going to have new kinds of cooperation. And just as much thinking we need to do about the new conflict types, we need to think about the new opportunities. But I also saw the influence of Chris, and I know, Andrea, you've collaborated with Chris Honeyman for years and years and years on many, many projects, but the wicked problems section and also the hybrid warfare stuff, I know that was a big passion of his. And, I think people feel like they have clarity. I know what negotiation is, and I know what mediation is, and I know what arbitration is. But when you start to get into the real world examples, all of the simplicity of those models fall apart because there's so many cross currents of complexity in these issues. And by presenting some of these really difficult to resolve conflicts, I think you really throw your students into productive confusion, because they've got to say, okay, you gave me these building blocks, but how do I apply it to this messy real world situation? So what do you think about that?
I mean, I love that phrase, productive confusion. That I think I will have to use again. That's great. That's really wonderful. Look, that chapter, I think Carrie and I had so much fun writing, because you're right. Like the beginning chapters, these are things we've wrestled with, talked about, taught for a long time, and really thinking about it. And then to realize, in some ways, I mean, I've been dealing with, writing about and taking students to Israel and focusing on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict long before the most recent blow up. And, and Carrie thinking about art, and she's used that example. I used to teach art law, the hybrid warfare, which is a recent thing. And for me, the fascinating realization as we were writing it, that there's actually this common thread in the things that are most challenging. And that is our lack of ability to use the tools, everything that we've taught up to here, you need to know those are really important building blocks. And then to start to build on them. So the hybrid chapters, which is really Carrie's love and creation for the last decade at least, of really thinking about how are we mixing and matching. And then we take you to the wicked problems of like, okay, good luck. And still, like, how can we assess these and take a step back, and really try to, it's like the quintessential, it's not you, it really is the problem. And what can we do, or what new tools, to Jim's question, what new tools can we develop? I think about the Elgin marbles, which are the Parthenon marbles, right? In my lifetime, that name has changed, right? So it's now the Parthenon marbles.
Sitting in the British Museum, right?
Right,
Yeah.
sitting in a British museum, would AI or better technology or whatever be able to provide both spaces with something that's worthwhile for, frankly, for tourists to come? Because that the common interest is tourism, right? In the wonderful museum that they've built in Athens and in the incredible British Museum. Yes, it's for the locals, but it's also for all of us to go and visit these, right? And so anyway, it's just it's a really interesting, it was a fun chapter to write, to really try to bring that together.
If I can, Andrea, I don't know if you know this, I think it's going to be published in a new issue of the Journal of Legal Education, but this just warmed my heart, as you know, and you have too. I've taught in Israel a great deal. And so the University of Haifa, where I've been a lot, a bunch of the students there and a couple of the teachers created a clinic around our ADR ideas in the middle of the war. I mean, they've been dealing with, Haifa is one of the more integrated of the universities, so there are a lot of Israeli Arabs and Druze, and as well as Israeli Jews, and they actually put together. I just saw the description of it. They were using my materials, and they're writing an article about the actual application of these ideas to get students to try to work on solutions in the crucible of a conflict. I mean, what could be more heartwarming to a teacher? So, that's why I say we like to give them problems and then say, here's some material, and see what you can come up with. And you're right, Colin, because a lot of those folks are very AI literate and technology literate, and so that's one of the things that bridging. You know this better than I do, Andrea. The word for mediation in Hebrew is something like bridge, and so these kids are trying to use computer technology to try to figure out some bridging communication.
Sure.
At the lower, I want to say lower, at the people to people level, while the people creating wars and diplomatic negotiations are up here. So that's a heartwarming. I mean, that's why you write a book, to have an effect on the world. And so it's very heartwarming that a little bit of it's happening.
Well, when we talk about cultures too, I think there's an emerging digital culture.
Yeah.
And these young people are digital first. I mean, they were born into a world where these tools always existed. So when you talk about new forms of conflict and new forms of cooperation, I think a lot of young people, I mean, I've seen this in India because I spent a lot of time in India. The younger generation, they are fluent in the use of technology. So when they encounter a problem, like delays in the civil justice system or a dispute with Pakistan, immediately they go to technology. Well, how can we use these tools? So I think that's fascinating. Andrea, it's funny, you were talking about being a research assistant to Roger. And before he passed away, I had dinner with Roger in Cambridge, and he had all these amazing stories about, yeah, I mean, I went and I met with Golda Meir and we talked about this, or I went and met with the Sandinistas and we talked about this. And I was like, it was amazing to hear these stories, but there was no framework for it. I just kind of felt like he kind of winged it when he went in. And obviously, Roger's known for some of the key tenets of getting to yes and things like that. But what I love here is I feel like you're providing kind of a structured way to think about these elements. And that blueprint may be of the most utility, I think, to scholars who are trying to figure this out, because anecdotes only get you so far.
Right.
And as I say, we focus on the last story we've heard. So, do you think that you've provided kind of a framework for thinking about these things? I mean, you do talk a lot about dispute systems design, and you've got Jan and Stephanie and Lisa's, framework in there too. I know, Andrea, you have your piece, but do you think that we're close to a dispute systems design rubric for international conflict? And was that one of the things that you were trying to do in this book, was provide a structured way to think about it?
I mean, I don't know that there's a single rubric. I think this really goes to the pluralism piece of, and I see Verlin's question, which I'm sure we'll get to, but really, I think what we can provide as scholars is our frameworks, right? Our ways of saying like, well, if it's this, then this, and this, it's, ways of thinking about things. But the idea that there is a single pathway of, oh, if we only map on Ireland, why can't George Mitchell, if we figured out Northern Ireland,
right,
why can't we figure out Israel, Palestine with this? And you're like, no, right? Like, why are they still fighting in Kashmir? Also, no, right? Like,
Well, and you have the
we
piece
can.
comparing George Mitchell and Holbrooke in Bosnia-Herzegovina versus Northern Ireland. That's really interesting,
Right,
right?
right. And I think people do try to figure out like what are the personal characteristics of the mediator, what are the structural things, what do they bring to bear? And that's really important, obviously, for us to have some theories about what is effective. But the sort of blind optimism, I think sometimes that frankly we culturally have of like, we're just going to map on what we know here and place it somewhere else in
Let's just sit
another.
down at the table and we'll work it out. Yeah, that's
Like
right. There.
that doesn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me pick up on Verlin's question in the chat. And it's
Sure, sure,
the one
please.
you asked, Colin, about culture. Very much on my mind at the moment. So in Trump's first term, I was part of the group that special edited a journal of the Negotiation Journal about how Trump was going to change negotiation culture. And you think it was bad in the first term. We've been having discussions on the editorial board about whether we should do another one. That is about the most blatant form of the significance of culture in our field that I've
Mm,
seen. Because as you were describing, Colin, a digital culture, and I'm not alone in this. Roger thought this, and Jeff Rubin thought this. All the original founders at PON believed that we were creating a negotiation culture that did have a structure. I don't think you're being fair to Roger. Every time I talk to him about an international problem, he did have a structure.
mm,
What do they want? What do we want? And how
mhm.
can we try to figure out something that works for what both parties want? And he had some very basic questions every time
No,
he
no,
went
that's
to bed.
great. Yeah.
And so, and so I believe all of us, Andrea, me, every one of us, were working from that root place that we were creating a culture to change the world. And at the 25th anniversary of the book of Getting to Yes, where I gave one of the talks, Roger was very upset, even though it had already been translated into I don't know how many gazillion languages, that the culture of the world hadn't changed and people were still fighting. Well, and I
Mm,
got upset. Oh, you're wrong. We're all teaching with it. So many people have bought this book. It's been translated into so many languages. And then when Trump came, it is so we are now in a moment where bullying and distributive bargaining and competition is becoming a world culture again, and the wars. We're back to war. We're back to conflict. We're back to zero-sum scarce resources, territorial claims instead of sharing land. We had the DMZ in the North Korea, South Korea war, that we had many ways that we were developing that actually instantiated some of the ideas in Getting to Yes and some of my work and Andrea's in negotiation.
sure.
And so, yes, Verlin, I understand you're also talking about, national culture and ethnic cultures and all these mini cultures, not so many, subcultures all over the world, which can inhibit communication across cultures. I've never had an issue with that myself because I grew up in a European household in a mixed religious background. I'm used to dealing in multicultural settings. I grew up in ethical culture in New York City. I've traveled the world. I love cultural richness and I don't like cultural reductionism.
Hmm.
And so I've been among those people, so is Andrea, and so have you, Colin, people working in multicultural settings. I love it. That's where we get good ideas from.
Hmm.
And I worry, I want to say, because, the book got published before all the latest round of terrible conflict resolution behavior.
Sure, sure.
So culture is really important because now we have to figure out essentially how to get out from under this big rock again. The rock that was the Cold War and World War II and
Hmm.
binarism and on off and, brittle solutions in courts, win and lose. And we were moving, I believe, that's why we wrote this book. We were moving in a direction of people seeing lots of other ways other than fighting to resolve things.
Hmm.
So I know both of you probably meant other things by culture, but I want to say right now, the cultural issue on my plate is what is happening to our culture of dispute resolution.
Hmm. Hmm.
So you can be hopeful, Colin, around the digital and computer problem solving. I'm less sanguine about what's out there in the ether in terms of what and we're not the only one with a authoritarian president. Authoritarianism is on the rise, not just the United States, but elsewhere. So that's a
Yeah.
larger, zeitgeist or culture in which the work that we do is now embedded. And that I hope that the new generation will work on that one.
Well, absolutely. I will say, the time when I hung out with Roger, I never took a class from Roger. It was a dinner party at the later stages of his life. So maybe that's why I felt it was anecdotes. I did, however, take the international mediation class with Eileen Babbitt at Fletcher. And I remember in that class, we talked about 5 intransigent ethnic conflicts. We talked about Northern Ireland. We talked about Cyprus. We talked about Nagorno-Karabakh, which was Armenia and Azerbaijan. We talked about Sri Lanka, and we talked about Israel and Palestine. And the interesting thing is, 4 of the 5 have pretty much been resolved, right? Northern Ireland at the time was considered a very sticky problem, but it became a political process, right? And that was largely, Jerry was the one who drove it in that direction. So we don't have bombs going off anymore. I'm reading this interesting book, Say Nothing, which is all about that,
that is an
narrative history.
Watch the TV series.
Yeah, that's a great show too. And then also Sri Lanka, essentially the Tamils were all murdered. They elected a militaristic government and they went in and they killed the rebels. I think Cyprus, really, the Greeks had a lot of political instability, so they just kind of gave up. Nagorno-Karabakh is flaming back a little bit, right? So it's not like it's 100% resolved, right? But I mean, the one that's way worse, than it was after all this time is Israel and Palestine, right? And I know, Carrie, you and I have been to Haifa together, right? And our good friend Orna hosted an ODR forum there. You've been there many, many times. I've done a lot of work with USIP, and it's also part of this whole retrenchment that we're seeing is USIP has been completely shut down and everyone was fired, right?
It's back, Colin.
I saw George, the general counsel got an injunction, which is good, but how can you build it back? But the criticism of dispute resolution has long been that we are naive about power. And I remember learning this when I was first getting involved with it, because I was so excited about conflict resolution. I had a professor who made me read all the critics. So Laura Nader is like, they're naive about power. And and that's kind of what we're seeing, right? This Trump pushback. And Carrie, I mean, all of us on this call, I think we're probably have fundamentally cosmopolitan orientation. We like cultural diversity. We like different approaches. We think that's strength. But to have power now in the hands of people who say diversity is weakness, it's about cultural supremacy, and then essentially power is we're back to the law of the jungle, which was international relations prior to the League of Nations. So I don't want to go too deep on Israel because I know that could be a sticky subject, but you make a good point, Carrie. This is a moment where a lot of the work that we've done together in the field is being wiped off the table by people who haven't even read any of these books and don't care about any of these concepts because they have power and they're just jamming their perspective down the throats of the world. And how do we respond to that?
Well, one response, I'll say something briefly, and Andrea, I'm sure, will chime in. So you're optimistic about the digital world. I remain optimistic about the person-to-person world. I had an amazing experience last spring with, I think, our page proofs. We weren't out yet. Last spring, I had just spent the fall in Oxford, and things were bad at Oxford after October 7th, very bad. And when you say sticky, it was very sticky. I won't get into that unless people want to ask me about it. So I came back to teach at UC Irvine. I was very worried about what it was going to be like because I've always spent a unit on Israel, Palestine in my international conflict resolution course, an upper level course.
Sure.
And so the enrollment, interestingly, was lower than it had been because everybody in most campuses, I'm sure Andrea will attest this, were afraid. And this was, the encampments were beginning to happen on our campus. And in fact, what happened was I had a class of about 15, which is smaller than I usually have. And over a course of a 15-week semester where people get to know each other, I had an Israeli-born American student defending Israel, and a student who's become a very close friend who is an Arab-American student, Egyptian and Syrian. And together, it was amazing the work they did together. They both did complementary papers. They came up with an idea of the Republic of Jerusalem a creative, maybe a fantasy. They actually, you'd love this, Colin. They used AI to generate a picture of what the Republic of Jerusalem would look like. And it was very interesting because it had elements, Andrew's laughing too, it had elements of a little bit of a beach development in Gaza, right, for monetary, rebuilding, but then also these very tall buildings of high-tech industry. And they, and I laughed. I said, I wish I would live long enough to see you two get the Nobel Peace Prize. So it was that. And so I've been asked to talk a lot about, how to facilitate these kind of conversations in class. And I have a simple answer to that, which is you can't do it on a one-time event. What happens in a course with a big book like this and people who are really seriously engaged in trying to solve problems, it takes time. It takes effort. It cannot be done like I refuse now to speak on a panel where, they just want you to talk about it for 10 minutes and then, give people the answer and then leave. It takes time. And I would say this is, Colin, you and I have been having this discussion for decades, in person. You have to have that kind of empathetic, mediative ability to look each other in the eye and talk about what's important to you and what you care about and, how you try to resolve it. So all I have
Well,
so I just want to say, within the horrors that I described of the macro world, I still believe in creating micro worlds, mostly in educational places, but not
sure.
in religious places, in churches and synagogues and mosques. I do a lot of work with the peace groups. Andrew knows this too, in Israel. So people go to mosques, they go to synagogues, they go to church. So places where people can try to counter some of that larger unpleasantness. And out of those smaller things, I think ideas will come. There won't be enough to defeat Trump. That's Colin knows it. This is my husband's business. My husband's a political consultant. So we have to have the politicians, take care of those things. In the meantime, we still have to get up every morning and try to make the world a better place.
Right. Well, Andrea, I want to come to you, but I just want to respond to. I noticed you did include your piece is ODR ADR, and you and I had a back and forth about that. So I was like, dang it, my rebuttal didn't make it into the book. But I think it is interesting. I mean, I just had lunch the other day with a former professor of mine, Jay Rothman, who's worked on Israeli-Palestinian dialogue for decades, and I said, this must be devastating to you, everything that's going on, with Netanyahu. And he said, absolutely, because to build these trust, to have these conversations, I think about Herb Kelman, I think about people that have been doing this work for decades. It's meticulous. It's like building a house of cards to put all of this together. And then in one incursion, it just gets all knocked off the table. So again, I don't want to rehash our back and forth about ADR and ODR, because I really believe that ODR is the future of ADR. And I agree with you about the power of in-person interaction. But if you look at the younger generation, it's clear the arrows are going in a certain direction. So I don't want to get into I don't want to talk too much about my stuff, but I do think, that's what I like when you talk about, we have to think about new kinds of conflict that are emerging, but we also have to think about new kinds of cooperation. And what really frustrates me is the younger generation, my kids included, I feel like they think dialogue has been delegitimized. Like, you cannot negotiate against somebody who is participating in bad faith, and they see the other side as patently acting in bad faith. So they're getting sucked into the power conversation as well. It's like the only solution is for us to get power and to fight back and to see who can get the upper hand. So that's worrisome to me, because I'm a dialogue guy, but maybe I understand their perspective. And it's interesting, and we see this in the ODR field. People are looking to AI to say, how should I resolve my dispute? And that's not what we teach in mediation, right? The parties have to come up with their own solution, because then they have ownership of it. But I'm seeing more mediations where parties are walking in saying, hey, ChatGPT said this is what we should do. And the other side says, okay, that's interesting. So are we outsourcing some of our agency to these algorithms? And there's pluses and minuses to that, but it's interesting to me that it seems like that's where it's headed. So Andrea, I'm sorry, I just waxed poetic. But what do you think about all of that?
Right. I'm going to, and I guess I want to pick up on 2 points. I mean, one is, within everything, I think if you look, 30, 40 years, I mean, in terms of at least what the domestic structures are, there is a sea change across the globe in terms of using mediation and negotiation versus more litigation in all of these societies. So at the same time that, you could pick, whether it's India, busy bombing over Kashmir, but, mediation is all over. And there's so much energy focused on that. Similarly in Israel, in the UK, where domestically there, I think, have been dramatic shifts in the legal culture, in what's being taught at law schools or in the undergrad legal program, really around the world. That I do, where I am optimistic is that does and will percolate up, and that this is, I think what's happening now is, ending FMCS, defunding USIP, like all of these things is horrifying, and it is a step back. It's not, it's, we're not going back to 1880. I mean, it is a step back. And I think our education and this generation of students and, have a different training. And at the same time, I think you've both already pegged what is a huge problem in that this generation, whether it's lawyers or frankly anybody of this age, between social media, between being raised in an electronic age, between COVID and the pandemic, which hit them at sort of key adulting periods of time where you would have in college or in early career had been with people who were not like you, and you might have learned to live with someone with whom you really disagreed politically, and that was the way that it is. There have been sort of moments where this generation, and now with the campus protests, where there has been no socialization or limited socialization in terms of dialogue. It's easier to cancel on social media than it is to engage. You didn't have the roommates, you didn't live, college was different for you. Campus, but if now you're in college or in law school, that's disrupted everything. There seems to be absolutely no reward for any middle ground, any dialogue. And they're going to hit the workspace, and all of a sudden, they're going to be promoted on their ability to listen and ask good questions, and they don't have it. And for us, and look, that's the next generation of diplomats also. So, I do think that there is, I hope that as we step back and sort of worry about what Trump is doing at the top in terms of changing culture, and there are plenty of authoritarian governments around that are changing the culture at the top. Grassroots has been the most successful in making a difference in Ireland, in other conflicts. How are we making sure that the people at the grassroots in this next generation have the skill and the interest and the belief that their engagement will matter? And that's where I'm worried.
Well, I want to go deeper on Verlin's point about culture too, because I think culture is not a static thing. We sometimes talk about culture as well. The American culture is this, and British culture is this, and there's obviously many kinds of cultures, right? There's regional cultures, and there's educational cultures, and so it's all overlapping. But one thing that I thought was very interesting, they talk about the culture war, right? The culture is being changed in front of our very eyes, and the internet is affecting that. Trump is affecting that. So it might be that, you talked about, Andrea and I agree with this. I remember the first time I saw somebody say win-win on TV, I was like, we're doing it, we're changing the minds, like the vernacular is getting out there. We're having an impact on the culture. But at the same time, other people, the conflict exacerbators are also putting their own. One of the things interesting to me is I see Trump's social media posts, and he says, we have mediated the conflict between India and Pakistan. We're mediating a resolution in Congo, which is very interesting. Why is he using that word? Because I think that there is, in sort of his lizard brain, I'm sorry, I don't mean to get political here, but there's some beneficial thing, like I am the mediator, I'm doing this good thing for the world, when in fact we can see, many of his behaviors are the opposite of what we think would be the right thing to do in these circumstances. But I think when Verlin's talking about, have you dealt with the difficulties of the processes juxtaposed with cultural differences domestically and internationally? I think you have some pieces talking about high context versus low context culture. And, I think, John Barkai, I think, has a piece talking about that. How can a low context person mediate a high context case? What do you think about the facets of culture in all of this? And obviously taking a socio-legal approach, most of the legal people that I talk to and most of the international arbitrators, you start talking about culture and they're like, that's not the way I think about this at all. That's not relevant to how I perform my services. So Carrie, what do you think about that?
It's quite relevant. Let me say two things. One is I just finished coaching our VIS team. VIS is the International Arbitration Competition. And I had done it before, but UCI just sent their first team. And we have a multicultural team. Our 6 students all have different national backgrounds, including 2 born in China, who are American JD students. And they came back and reported, I don't know who you're talking to, Colin, that the key thing that struck them was the different cultures, even in international arbitration, where everybody is competing under the same rules. And they got yelled at, and they weren't alone, for, apparently this goes on every year, for being too American argumentative, even though I'm coaching them not to be. And I was very lucky. I had coaches from other countries who mooted my students, you'll appreciate this, on Zoom. So one step forward was my students were getting trained multiculturally by having coaches outside of the United States, giving them that kind of advice. It was fascinating, Andrew, you'd appreciate this, how powerful their socialization was in an American law school, even being my student.
Right.
That when they go to those, and you go to more than I do, these
we sent a team to Viz also.
Jump right into that. So, and I've been an international arbitrator. So anyone who tells you, and I've written, I don't know, you know, it's part of my work, Colin, but I did a lot of work in Switzerland with, and the ICC in Paris. The issue of procedural rules in international arbitration is extremely cultural, and it's civil cultures and common law cultures very different, and arbitrators argue all the time about whose legal rules are going to govern in these settings. So I came into that was 25 years ago, very interested in how even something like our procedural rules are quite culturally specific. So
absolutely. I would even argue that international arbitration has its own culture.
Yes, so culture is there. And the only other thing I want to say, this is what I worry about, Andrea, since we both teach abroad. When I was at Oxford in the fall of 23, we were finishing our book, and we were having, nobody's asked how we wrote this book. We had every other week. Andrea is amazing to work with.
I do want to ask about that, yeah, because you guys have written a lot together.
You know, Andrea's just, you know, been my, you know, basically my manager for as long as we've been working together. We had a very disciplined process of writing and alternating chapters, commenting on each, and then having calls. You know, I was in England, and she was commuting between Wisconsin and New York. And we managed to have very regular calls and go through our thoughts, our texts, our moving things around, or talking about this. Very, you know, that two heads are always better than one. An incredibly collaborative process. Meanwhile, I was sitting in Oxford after October 7th, and I became very close to a group of women graduate students who were all from outside of England, all of them. Afghan, Lebanese, Israeli, Indian, German. It was extraordinary. So I'm sorry to get on this horse, but given what Trump did yesterday, banning international students from Harvard, which has also been temporarily restrained this morning, we are not going to have much influence culturally or otherwise. Those kids, young kids, next generation. So yes, they were computer literate. They were also brilliant. And we were sitting around arguing political theory, you know, Carl Schmitt, Hobbes, back to the basics. And they were doing both. And not a single one of the people in that graduate group was a classical colonial Brit, if I may say that. It was incredibly diverse, and far more diverse than almost anything I've seen, other than, you know, at Harvard and UC, some of our best institutions, Stanford, where Colin hangs out. And so I think here's the positive side: the multicultural world of students and young people who are working in a multicultural world, they are pretty fluid with each other. In small groups, they're actually pretty honest about disagreeing with each other, and that's, you know, that's percolating, it's cooking. And again, Colin, I'm sorry to ring my bell, but this has to be in person. And what I fear is that it ain't going to be at Harvard or Yale or Stanford or UC anymore. It's going to be happening in National University of Singapore, where I've taught, in Australia, still a little bit in Hong Kong, and in the great universities in Europe that are also getting stripped in many ways. But you know, international conflict resolution. If I can say this for a moment, the advantage of this book, even though it's in English, is that it can be taught and worked with in other places. And that's my hope, because I still hope we can continue to have these creative moments in the United States. But one answer, Colin, is multicultural engagement outside of the hegemony of the United States. If
absolutely. I actually think that you know, in a sense, if the current administration wants to exit us from these dialogues don't stop. And in a sense, you know, the United States was the hyperpower for a long time. We had outsized influence in a lot of these conversations. So, you know, I mean, telling all these genius grad students that they can't go to Harvard, well, what's going to happen? They're going to go to Canada. They can study with Verlin. They're going to go to Oxford. They're going to go to Singapore. They're going to go, you know, and I think in a sense, maybe it will accelerate some of the, you know, exiting the conversation doesn't mean the conversation stops. It just means you're not at the table anymore. So, yeah. So Andrea, say a little bit about your experience of writing the book as well. You know, I mean, you guys are frequent collaborators. It sounds like you love to chew these things over. Although I know you didn't do it in person.
We did. Oh, but we did. We tried as often as possible, and I would come and camp out in LA.
Okay,
and
good.
Carrie's come. No, we've actually tried. I think actually. So sorry, Colin.
No. I couldn't resist. But yeah.
Multimedia.
Multimedia. No, I mean, I think actually, and look, it's a model for, I think, all working relationships of, you know, when we're really digging in about like what chapter, in what order, which reading, which writer, which this, which that. Like, that was great to have a day and a half where we're face to face pulling things off of Carrie's shelves at her house and just like, do we like this? Does this mean? Right. On the execution side of things, we can be on opposite sides of the ocean and, you know, each executing what we think. But I actually think the brainstorming and the sort of checking in, like, are you good? What's your timing? Those sort of like, how are we viewing this? What's our goal in this particular thing? We've benefited from actually regular in-person sort of retreats to get this done. And it's been a model for me, I'll say, you know, not only on this book, but on other books as well. Just that sort of in-person, there's nothing else you're thinking about. You guys are just talking to each other for however long, is a really effective model, I think, for getting things done.
If I might, Colin, you started the conversation with this, and I just need to do a shout out to Andrea and her fabulous research assistants. The permissions was an unbelievable thing. And Andrea and I have learned, I don't know how many people on this call know about our other text, but our big dispute resolution text with first Little Brown, then Aspen, then Walters Kluwer, now we're back at Aspen, has been a nightmare because the permissions, you know, neither of us wrote this to make a lot of money. We wrote it out of love, but that book, the permissions costs basically ate up almost any of the royalties for a very long period of time. And so shout out to Andrew's amazing, research assistants and just incredible, big Excel sheet and this one, if I can point to her, I know you're next to me on the
She's next to me on my screen. Right. Yeah.
So I may have started writing about negotiation before Andrea, just because I'm older. But if you need something negotiated, you go to her.
Oh yeah,
she's amazing.
And I've got her books on my desk, and they're tomes, man.
So,
they are right.
So you know, behind me, I have some book about how to negotiate a book contract, and I started doing it a long time ago. But we actually negotiated with publishers and with individual authors wherever they could to waive their permission fees. And to shout out to Academic Carolina Press. They were amazing. They were sorry, I'm going to get in trouble here. We're recording this. They were much better to work with than Aspen. And so we were able to, and I have to say another shout out to both of us, if I might say. By the time we got to this book, Andrea and I had both written so many of the articles that we wanted to use to put the book in our own voices.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
That fortunately, we didn't have to pay permissions for our own work. But for anyone on the call here who's, thinking about writing any kind of anthology, it's expensive, it's time consuming, and it requires incredible both organization, which Andrea has, and also incredible skill. So
I couldn't agree more.
My pleasure.
I know you did this out of love because I don't think that there's a lot of money that you're making here. And but I did put a link to the table of contents. I mean, we're talking about a 500-page book here, right? So click on it and take a look at the resources that are there. So Paula,
wait, one other word about Andrea's negotiating. For those of you who know me, know that this is my favorite color, and she did that.
Very smart.
The book, book publishers, especially in law, are all kind of doing standard whatever. And I love this cover almost as much as I love everything inside. So thank you, Andrea.
Thank you for not getting
You're
another
welcome.
brown and green leather-bound book that just
Right
says.
now, I'm very picky. I'm like, no, like I want it to be lovely to look at too.
Well, I know we're getting to the end of our time here, and Paula, you put a great comment in the chat. Do you want to just
wonderful question,
elucidate verbally,
that's
the
really...
question, and we'll end there? Yeah, please.
Thank you for that opportunity. I just want to appreciate you all for bringing this conversation today. And I've been absorbing a lot of what you've been sharing. And when you were touching on how you approached writing the book, for me, it's reflecting what I'm seeing in the current kind of trends of dispute resolution itself. Hybrid conversations, a lot more asynchronous work, which I am finding really valuable because folks get a chance to absorb and process what may have occurred in that facilitated session or pre-meeting or whatever it may be. And all of the earlier conversation about the areas of conflict, the degrees of conflict, we didn't touch on climate issues, but I think those also reflect here as well. And I do think trauma is a real aspect of things where having that space to absorb and process and consider how that may be affecting the dynamics of the conflict, the communication of the parties, the willingness to hear and be heard. And so I'm seeing all and teasing out all of these threads and rapidly trying to convince myself not to completely rewrite the false curriculum. But I do see opportunities to adjust how I'm approaching teaching to my law students here in Seattle. And so I thank you for the opportunity to fuel those thoughts.
I really like the way you phrased it there. And I think that, you know, this idea that it's one negotiation and you're going to negotiate for 5 hours until you're done, and you know, or one mediation is actually not helpful. It's not helpful in the way that we think. It's not helpful how we process. And that here's where technology already has made a difference and can continue to make a difference of just, you know, when are you in person? When are you on email? When are you in Zoom? And just letting things sort of percolate and choosing wisely. I love it all. So thank you for writing that.
Well, great. I know we're at time. Thank the two of you for spending the hour. Do you have any final comments, Carrie, that you want to make? Takeaways? Go buy the book. This is amazing. Yeah, sign it in your classes. This is a real gift to the field. And I want to thank the two of you for all the work that you put in. You know, I think somebody who's starting a class and saying, where do I begin? To be able to sort of sit at your elbow and have you say, look, we've done this 25 countries, 15 years, you know, 50 years of scholarship, Carrie. These are the pieces that we find. These are our case studies. This is our teaching guide. I think this is going to shape the way people learn about these subjects for a long time to come. So thank you for sharing it with us. Thank you for spending the hour with us today. And
thank you for having us, and tell us what you think.
Absolutely. Just like the end of the introduction. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you again soon. Have a great long weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.